So welcome everyone. I'm really happy to be moderating this event, which is officially launching this new book, which is linked to in the chat, Canada Among Nations 2021 Canada and Great Power Competition. My name is Laura Mcdonald, and I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science and the Institute of Political Economy at Carleton University. And normally I would start such an event with a land acknowledgement, but I was a little confused what to do, as I'm actually currently on British land, which is one of the colonizers as well. But I would just say that we'll keep in mind that I am normally, and many of you are located on traditional unceded and unconquered Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. And I hope we'll all think about the realities of colonial domination in our country that shaped many of the issues that we'll be discussing today. So this book, which is published by Palgrave, was co-edited with my Carleton colleagues, David Carment of the School of International Affairs and Jeremy Paltiel, recently and sadly retired from political science at Carleton. Unfortunately, neither of them could be with us today, but they're with us in spirit. Canada Among Nations, as many of you know, is an annual survey of Canada's position in the world and the challenges it is facing in that given year. I'd like to thank David Carment, who's the series editor, who invited me and Jeremy to participate in editing this year's edition, which brings together a stellar group of contributors to examine how Canada is faring in the context of the decline of the liberal economic international order and the rise or continuation, escalation of hostilities between the US, China, increasingly Russia, as well as Canada. In this particular webinar, we'll be focusing on the first section of the book, which is mostly addressing Canada's international economic policies. This section brings together 5 excellent contributions that evaluate how Canada's neoliberal policies have been adapting in the context of those challenges we faced in 2021 and in many ways continue to face. In that year, though, the COVID pandemic was intensifying both longstanding weaknesses and ushering in new challenges in the global international economic system and in Canadian domestic policies. At the same time, the global climate change crisis was becoming ever more urgent and becoming ever more urgent. Patterns of global inequality drawn along class, racial, and gender lines were becoming even more intense in the context of the pandemic. And I can't say that they're becoming any better. I would say, though, these overlapping crises open up space and create opportunities to rethink Canada's economic strategies and its role in the global political economy. So this is the challenge we put before our authors, which is to discuss in their respective fields how they see how those challenges are playing out. I should mention that there are 2 other chapters in this section, one by Tony Porter and Anwar Shaluchan, both of McMaster on Canada and financial governance, and one by Erin Hanna of Western University and Adrian Roberts and Silke Trommer, both of Manchester, where I'm currently based, on Canada's feminist trade policy, but they weren't sadly able to join us today. I posted a link to the book and I'll do so again for those coming in late. So hopefully you can check out all of the excellent contents of this book and buy it or ask your institution to do so, so you'll have access to this great cutting edge analysis. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, iAffairs, and Carleton's Institute of Political Economy for co-hosting this event, and especially Anthony Dion, who really helped out with the organizations. So I'll briefly introduce each of the authors, and they will each speak for about 7 minutes. I should mention that we were planning to have a 1 hour long event, but somehow the ad came to read an hour and a half. So, and we didn't catch that in time, but we'll try to wrap up within about an hour and can go a little bit over time if there's interest in doing so. So the speakers are, and I'll introduce them in order. First, Stephen McBride and Noah Fry. Stephen is professor and Canada Research Chair in Public Policy and Globalization, and Noah is a PhD student, and they're both in the Department of Political Science at McMaster. Stephen will have to leave early, so he'll do the presentation of their chapter, and Noah will contribute to the Q&A and other discussion. Secondly, Elizabeth Smythe will speak. She is a professor of political science and coordinator of the political economy program at Concordia University of Edmonton. And finally, we'll have Stuart True, senior researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, CCPA, where he directs the center's trade and investment research project. And he'll present the chapter that he co-authored with Scott Sinclair, formerly of CCPA. So thanks to everyone for participating. And after the presentations, we'll open it up for discussion. So over to you, Stephen.
Okay, well, thanks very much to the organizers of this book launch. It's an interesting format to do it in, and certainly a first for me. And thanks also to the three book editors who've put together, a really interesting collection of papers and chapters. The chapter that Noah and I have written is called Locked In, Canadian Trade Policy and the Declining Liberal Order. It notes the decline of that order, sometimes called a rules-based international order, which we depict as based on embedded neoliberalism, to distinguish it, I guess, from the previous order, which was often called, characterized as embedded liberalism. Written in the fall of 2021, this chapter notes that the existing order faced various challenges, some external, some security, some economic, from powers like China and Russia, as argued by John Mearsheimer, for example, and internal challenges, which could be characterized as the rise of right-wing populism in opposition to what Nancy Fraser and others depicted as progressive neoliberalism. Anyway, all of that is kind of background, but the real context in the trade area is the long-term struggle for future hegemony between the United States and China, although our own focus is more on American strategy and on the Canadian response or non-response to that sort of changing context. A rules-based international order, as the phrase implies, supposedly brings about certainty and predictability about the way states will deal with each other and their interactions. Written in the fall of 2021, our chapter notes increased unilateralism, protectionism, and sanctions, the changing posture of the United States to rules which it had designed and previously accepted. A trend, by the way, we don't confine to Trumpism. We see it as a longer run manifestation of American policy to which Trump contributed a particular style, but underlying it is perhaps a longer run strategy. And we look at indicators like the World Uncertainty Index, which unsurprisingly was showing an increase in uncertainty throughout this period, all typical of a declining order of affairs. We also note in the paper that Canada's enthusiastic backing of the old order and what we regard as its largely unchanged stance in this period of decline of that order. There's a quote somewhere in the chapter it's a government document. The government of Canada is aware that criticism of international trade and globalization has led to protectionist movements and a retreat from the international rules-based order, a system that has provided unparalleled prosperity for Canada and others, etc. One can debate the accuracy of that summation, but the document goes on to attribute this backlash against that order to the failure of domestic governments to communicate its benefits. So our position, on the other hand, is it's not really a failure of communication. It's that the experience provided by that order has led to a dramatic rethinking in many countries. In any event, be that as it may, our paper argues that Canada's response to the changing environment has not been innovative, really. It's been rigid rather than flexible. Canada's chosen binding neo-constitutional rules rather than the creation of space for agile and flexible policies. Our trade policy reflects a commitment to principles which are no longer broadly accepted, or at least often violated by others, and shows no signs of a rethink or reconsideration of whether the existing strategy remains the right one. So the substance of the paper actually looks to try and substantiate those points. Looks at a series of recent Canadian trade agreements, such as the CUSMA or NAFTA 2.0, as some people have it, the CETA, the agreement with the Europeans, and the CPTPP. Congratulations to self for getting that acronym out for a change. I usually stumble over it. Anyway, in an analysis of those agreements, we basically make the point for continuity and a doubling down of Canadian trade policy, so I don't think I really have time to go through that body of evidence, but anyway, I'm here to help Laura sell the book, so if you want to see the evidence, read the chapter would be part of the message, I suppose. Basically, though, the conclusion we reach is that some words spoken by Minister Freeland in 2017 continue to apply. She said then, "We will robustly support the rules-based international order and all its institutions and seek ways to strengthen and improve them." And we don't see an awful lot as having changed since then. In other words, there's an opportunity, or actually one might say the decline of that order creates an imperative to rethink, or at least reconsider, whether those existing rules continue to serve Canadian interests. And right at the end, we suggest a small number of areas which could be the subject of a reconsideration and rethink, but have not been. Those areas are whether agreements can be used to enhance states' capacities and flexibilities rather than limit them, to weaken the privileges that capital derives from those agreements rather than to reinforce them, and to recalibrate relations between the global North and South. So in a nutshell and stripped of details, that's what that chapter is about. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephen. And so next we have Elizabeth Smythe speaking about her excellent chapter on investment policy.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody who's attending today. And a particular thank you to Laura, who originally invited me to contribute a chapter to this really excellent collection. And it's been a pleasure meeting some of the contributors to the chapter for the first time in different meetings we've had over the last year and a half. My chapter is entitled Canada's Changing Foreign Investment Regime in a Time of Global Crisis and Transition. But having reread my chapter, I think I should have put a question mark after Canada's Changing Foreign Investment Regime, because what my chapter essentially argues is that what a change has come has been very slow, very incremental. I think I use the term tinkering at the margins, and most of the change not initiated by Canada at all, but usually by some sort of opposition within a trade negotiation or a bilateral investment negotiation. So essentially, I focus on two of the three aspects of what we call a country's foreign investment regime. And I focus on two because the third, which is seeking to attract incoming investment, is pretty straightforward and not an area where there's a lot of debate or discussion about what we should be doing. Rather, it's the two areas dealing with protecting our investors abroad, that is Canadian investment abroad, and the other is screening incoming capital that seeks to acquire large Canadian corporations. So investment screening essentially, and what I call investor protection. And in the chapter, and again, with a limited amount of time, I won't go into too much detail, but starting with investment protection, I essentially argue that since Canada became a net capital exporter in the late 1990s, that the focus of Canadian investment policy has been on protecting foreign investors. And the defining agreement for investor protection is Chapter 11 of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And I'm assuming many of you are familiar with it, which gives corporations a capacity to go after host state regulations that are perceived to indirectly or directly expropriate their assets. And we know that that's led to a large number of cases being initiated against the Canadian government. The zeal for this type of investor protection was so great on Canada's part that it tried to multilateralize this kind of agreement at the World Trade Organization and prior to that at the OECD, both of which more or less failed. And so Canada moved very quickly, as many states did that are capital exporters, into bilateral investment treaties, or what Canada calls foreign investment protection agreements. And this continued even though increasingly in the last decade, there has been growing concern, particularly about bilateral investment treaties and their impact on developing countries, particularly as corporations and financiers discovered that they could use investment state dispute settlements to win outrageous settlements against countries that I would argue were legitimately seeking to, for example, protect their environment. And so the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development talks about a BITS backlash as early as 2012. And yet Canada continued right up until the renegotiation of NAFTA to basically, with minor incremental changes, to support this kind of investor protection. It was only when the United States and the European Union in negotiations resisted that model that Canada agreed to changes. And in fact, the ending of ISDS in the NAFTA renegotiations was not, in fact, initiated aggressively by Canada, but rather by the United States Trade Representative in the US. So that's investor protection. One would expect, after losing so many NAFTA cases, after the BITS backlash, and consultations with key stakeholders, Canada would revise their foreign investment protection agreements in major ways. And that proved not to be the case. There were some revisions that clarified the question of expropriation, and there are some areas of reform to who the arbitrators are and various other things. But by and large, Canada sought to retain that form of protection. The other main element that I look at in my chapter is the question of screening. Screening incoming attempts to acquire large Canadian corporations, which has always been a subject of debate within Canada, but increasingly was moving in the direction of allowing larger and larger acquisitions of Canadian firms. And this is reflected throughout the last 2-3 decades. However, one of the developments that, again, Canada has had to react to is the increasing presence of state-owned enterprises as key investors, and particularly from what we might call non-democratic political regimes. And so the question of China and the acquisition of Canadian corporations by Chinese corporations has been a subject of some concern. The impact of the tensions between China and the US has spilled over into pushing Canada to more broadly define security. And as a result of COVID-19, has also caused Canada to basically be more careful in scrutinizing takeovers of Canadian firms. So I end the chapter by just kind of reassessing the impact of this increasing China-US tension and COVID-19 on this investment regime, and basically conclude, for example, in the case of a call for a moratorium on ISDS so that countries can deal with the public health crisis. The response I got from Global Affairs to our position on this was that Canada has not engaged in substantive discussions. And I think that nicely summarizes what Canada's been doing on the multilateral side in terms of investment regime change. And finally, in terms of the takeovers, Canada is very much being guided by increasing restrictions in the United States as it tries to carefully maneuver, as the book indicates, between the United States and China. And so following, I think, on Stephen, I would just say that where I might have expected to see some innovations, might have expected to see Canada try to use these changes globally to rethink its own position. It has not done so. Why it has not done so, I largely attribute to the influence of corporations over both liberal and conservative governments, and the incredible cross-party support for Canada's investment regime, which has resulted in what I call, again, tinkering at the margins. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Liz. And finally, we have Stuart True presenting his chapter that was co-authored with Scott Sinclair. Stuart?
That's right. Thanks very much, Laura, for the introduction, and to Stephen and Elizabeth for such insightful presentations. I'm afraid I'm going to cover a little bit of the same ground in my presentation. I think maybe that says something, that where so many people are agreeing on what's happening here with respect to some of these discrepancies, perhaps in Canada's and the United States response to this moment. Our chapter was called, first of all, I'm joining you from the CCPA's national office in downtown Ottawa on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. And the CCPA was very pleased to accept David and Laura and Jeremy's invitation to co-host this webinar with iAffairs and with the Institute of Political Economy at Carleton University. So thanks again for that, Laura. We look forward also to posting this on our website eventually. So we'll send out a link to that. Yeah, Scott's also, just to say, Scott's in storm-touched PEI. That's not the reason he's not here, but he does send his regrets, and he would very much have liked to have been here, sends his hellos. Our chapter was called Canada-US Relations in a Decarbonizing World. We might have called it, had we written it today, the new dawn of US industrial strategy or something along those lines. I think it's something Canada has to think very carefully about, where we go in this new world of US policy, as I'll kind of conclude in a moment. And as the previous two presenters have mentioned, like, hasn't been spending that much time thinking about it, or at least we haven't seen the signs that there's been considerable thinking about how Canada integrates or works with this new reality. So I suppose there's 5 main premises of our chapter. They probably could have been condensed into 3, but more or less, the first one being that Canada and US trade policy, as Stephen has been saying, it did move in parallel for quite a while after the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and up to probably around the Trump presidency. We see the major divergences appear with respect to America First. Rob Lighthizer, the USTR, being given quite a broad freedom to remake trade policy in his vision, very tariff-focused vision. But then you get on the Trudeau government side, you get this whole progressive trade vision, which basically was status quo, from our interpretation, with a few flourishes again on the margins, as Elizabeth was saying, some throws to small and medium-sized businesses and bringing more women-owned businesses into the business of trade, for example. The second point is that these divergences represent different responses and different, perhaps, diagnoses to the same political and economic events, namely populist backlash to institutions of global economic and political governance. We saw Brexit, we saw Trump's pulling out of NAFTA, also things like slow growth in the post-financial crisis period, growing inequality, of course, growing political polarization, and then after the pandemic, we have the supply chain risks. Again, this is as Stephen said, I think quite rightly, Canada appears to be more worried about the impression this is leaving than the reality of these real disruptions to the rules-based international order, especially with respect to trade. That's the third point. The fourth point being, or premise being, that the US response, therefore, is quite a bit more transformative, not just absolutely, but in very much, if you compare it to Canada, quite a bit more transformative than what is proposed here so far. So offshoring, for example, is no longer seen or no longer tacitly accepted, I suppose, in Washington as the huge benefit to corporate America that it was in the 90s, or that it was perceived to be in the 90s and 2000s. The preoccupation in the US with domestic industrial renewal, and in particular in high growth emerging technologies like AI, electrification, etc. This is a bipartisan, probably permanent shift in US policy. And Laura told us we couldn't use PowerPoints for today, which I think is a good idea, Laura, but I did have this image I wanted to use. You probably all seen it of Biden literally crossing the Rubicon with respect to industrial strategies. Anyways, hopping into an electric Jeep Rubicon, and he's kind of smiling and waving. And I do think that this signifies a real change in US course. Of course, there's different emphases, right? The Republicans, it's all about China, it's all about the military competitiveness, and they're worried about their magnets. They're worried about their keeping up with the next generation bombers and that kind of thing. But there is very real concerns with respect to manufacturing competitiveness as well, and reshoring, not just the manufacturing base, but even the resource extraction, right? The mining that has been offshored over the past 30 years. Biden wants that back as well, in order to stabilize, according to the government, to stabilize and secure supply chains of those critical minerals. So finally, Scott and I argue that while this domestic turn in the US challenges export dependent sectors in Canada, such as energy and automotive manufacturing, on the whole, this heterodox vision of how to achieve a more sustainable, decarbonized, and more equitable recovery from the post-crisis and perhaps post-pandemic period is attractive and potentially beneficial to both countries. So in other words, we feel that Canada should find ways to work with the US and of course not forget Mexico as the other North American partner, as we make the most of this domestic shift to industrial strategy. And of course, Biden, opening the door to exactly that kind of cooperation through these concepts of friendshoring. And for example, in the electric vehicle tax credit shift from buy American to kind of buy North American or buy trade partner components for those, the shift to electric vehicles. So without going into too much detail on the rest of the chapter, I won't talk about, we split it into 3 areas where we wanted to highlight the contrasting positions between the US and Canada. Obviously trade, I think Stephen has gone over that quite well, and pretty much exactly how I would have framed it in terms of the continuity in Canada versus this shift in the United States. I'll just mention an example being even the TPP, right? I mean, when Trump pulled out of that, Canada was only in the deal to begin with it for defensive purposes, to protect, it didn't want Canadian capital to lose out in the region if American capital was going to be gaining. Of course, American capital pulls out with Trump, and we still agree to this package minus these quite innovative labor provisions that the US had put in side agreements with Malaysia, Brunei, and Vietnam, which are much like the labor provisions of the new CUSMA with respect to not only requiring legal changes in Mexico, they would have required legal changes in Vietnam as well, but having a means to enforce that and make sure that it was a condition of both countries signing on to the agreement. Anyway, so much, I would say so much for Canada's progressive trade agenda. They simply called the agreement progressive while taking out probably the 2 or 3 most progressive parts of the agreement on labor. With respect to supply chain resiliency and security, we go over some of the efforts to, at that point, remember this was, we were writing this in 2001, concluding the chapters, the 100-day supply chain reviews that Biden had initiated across a number of departments had been just wrapped up. So we were able to look at the final report they put out, I think it was in June 2021. And, the underlying concerns in that review were with respect to manufacturing capacity weakness, corporate supply chain, focused on short-term capital returns over sustainable growth, for example. There was discussion of using industrial strategy successfully in allied countries of the United States and China. So this is very much already built into this 100-day reviews, since been fleshed out, obviously, in the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act just recently this year, putting some of that vision into practice. I think the emphasis in there on good quality jobs was quite positive as well. And there's been nothing comparable in Canada that we could see then. And I think we can say the same now in terms of that situational awareness. What do Canadian supply chains look like? Where are the weaknesses? And how might we use the power of the state to kind of get some more transparency in that area and have some more influence in that area? A third area, I won't go into any detail because I'm running out of time, was definitely procurement. Obviously, Buy American policies, very popular in the United States, bipartisan support, long-standing 100-year-old policies, not going anywhere. And in fact, as Stephen was saying, the shift here is across multiple administrations toward tightening the loopholes, increasing the local content quotas to abide by these federal transfers for infrastructure to the state level, for example, and federal spending as well. This is something that's not going away, and Canada's efforts to basically get inside that tent or to render those things neutral, I suppose, for Canadian producers have been not totally moot, but not very helpful over the past years. We should instead, as we say in the paper, we should find ways to reciprocate. Maybe we can turn towards more Buy North American policies, look at Buy Sustainable policies in Canada, because we have negotiated away quite a lot of Canada's policy flexibility to reproduce a Buy America type policy. We can't simply discriminate in favor of Canadian producers anymore, thanks to commitments we've made to the Europeans in CETA and commitments we made to the Americans as part of the Obama administration's negotiations around Buy America back then. So yeah, I guess in conclusion, US economic policy is shifting in response to economic disruptions and importantly to accommodate a new post-neoliberal order. This may take the form of reasserted national economic self-interest embodied in things like the Green New Deal and Build Back Better. It could look like the restoration of a Trump-style America First agenda, or it could mean deeper political gridlock and dysfunction in Washington, which we can still see. I mean, the Manchin is still kind of holding up, I think, now the government spending bill. Of course, it was based on a commitment that Biden made in the Inflation Reduction Act with respect to Biden's pipeline going through his state there. There are compelling reasons, I think, for Canada and the US to cooperate on efforts to decarbonize the continent's industrial production and to encourage more inclusive growth. But it will mean that Canada must be a willing, if agile, and less doctrinaire partner. It will also mean genuinely embracing a rapid transition away from fossil fuels, which has so far proven unpalatable to our political and business elites. And it will mean developing a more thoughtful critical minerals and electric vehicle production strategy than we've seen so far. So that's it, more or less. And thanks again, Laura, and thanks to everyone for being here.
Thanks so much, Stuart. I wish we should all applaud. Those are three fabulous presentations, a lot of agreement amongst the authors, interestingly, about the idea that the world is rapidly changing. A lot of the old assumptions are no longer valid, but we're not seeing a lot of creativity or boldness in the Canadian government's response to these shifting sands of the global international order. So yeah, so I'd like to open up the floor for questions. I think people can actually say their questions, but could you please raise your electronic hand if you have a question using the functions below. I think that's reactions, right? Yeah, so are there any questions or comments or responses to what's been said? Don't be shy. Do any of our panelists have any comments on other presentations? Oh, we lost Stephen. Noah, did you want to throw in a couple of your own 2 cents as well?
Sure. So thanks for having me, by the way.
Yeah.
I think one of the key observations within our book chapter is, we talk about the current rules-based international order and envision the potential for different postures to that order. It's not clear to us in reviewing Global Affairs Inclusive Trade Agenda or any other documentation related to their trade strategy that either the government understands that there's a difference between the rules-based international order and its neoliberal character, or wishes to really demonstrate that understanding in its policy choices. And another key observation, I think, kind of a difference of view within the book is how we frame Biden and whether he is a departure from Trump or not. For our part, Biden may well be sympathetic to some of the concerns Canada has around Buy America provisions, around American protectionism. I see it, and I think Stephen would agree, as a function of political resonance with protectionism. Biden is reacting to the popularity of Buy America provisions, and we've seen over time, the United States has pushed away from procurement expectations while Canada has become more comprehensive in our commitments to procurement as well. So there is a divergence there that I think Biden is continuing alongside Trump and earlier presidential administrations in following a kind of popular approach to trade, and the extent to which he is a departure from that, and personally may not so much matter if it's a political function and political calculation.
Thanks, Noah. So Gavin, you have a question? You can turn your video on.
Hopefully you can hear me because I forgot my
Yeah.
headphones.
Oh,
Yeah.
Fine, good.
Great. Those are wonderful presentations. Thanks, everyone. I'd just like to ask to anybody on the panel, it was going through my mind as you're all giving your presentations, is why Canada is so firm, particularly on investment rights. And I think you all said things about that we can put together, but I still want to ask again, like, what is it about Canada in particular? Is it just because Canada is politically and ideologically dedicated to the idea of investment rights and it won't let go? Or is there something else about the structure of the Canadian economy or Canadian political economy that makes Canada more dedicated than many other powers now as they're kind of backtracking on investment rights? Or even when it comes to, say, the conflict in Germany over CETA, which we don't really have in Canada over investment rights. Thanks.
Thanks, Gavin. Maybe I'll ask Liz to start out.
Yeah,
and then
I'll
we'll see if
start
anyone
because-
else has
yeah.
a response.
Yeah, I was kind of challenged to address this in my chapter after the first draft. I think it's a number of things, but I'll just mention a couple that stand out. One of them is the cross-party consensus. It is so strong, and it came across in parliamentary hearings on ISDS, that a final report was so laughably weak and had a total of 2 adenine recommendations. And when the deputy minister went before the committee, he also said something fairly revealing about why Canada, he wasn't directly asked why Canada hasn't done more in terms of putting some stronger parameters around ISDS. And he said, you know, our mining sector has done very well under investment protection. And I went back and looked at UNCTAD. Well, sure enough, a huge proportion of the ISDS cases that Canada's companies have launched, a large proportion of them are in the mining sector. And so I would argue it's partly to some degree corporate influence, but it's also kind of an ideological consensus. Now, I would point out in the US, there's quite a lot of division as well. When Lighthizer put forward the proposal to drop ISDS, the corporate sector was, including the mining sector, was absolutely livid and pushed very, very hard to try and stop it. And they were unsuccessful. But so US corporations as well are, I would say, as supportive of ISDS. And that's why it stayed with Mexico in the new agreement, was because of a push by politicians in Texas and a number of the petroleum corporations on that issue. So, but in Canada, I think it's both this strong consensus across the 2 major parties and the influence of the corporate sector.
Thanks, Liz. John, is this about investment issues or another question?
Definitely.
Okay, go ahead.
As we know, NAFTA, Chapter 17 and the TRIPS agreement deal with intellectual property. And arguably one of the big failures of Canada's investment approach in the area of pharmaceuticals has been that we now have roughly a $7 to $8 billion deficit compared with almost nothing going back to the mid-1980s. So has there been any reflection at all by the federal government about what could be seen as a major policy failure, and any thought about what they might do to address what is actually quite a significant balance of payments deficit now, never mind the impact on jobs and so forth in Canada?
Thank you, John. Anyone want to take that? Stuart?
Sure, I could try to take that, John, and I appreciate the question. Very, very timely question, especially with all the discussion around attracting investment for COVID vaccines and other medical technologies. I don't know. I can't answer it for sure. I mean, I haven't seen any proof of this, but it seems clear the government's committed to a high intellectual property rights regime in order to attract investment. And as you know, like as we were talking about recently, it hasn't panned out in terms of at least pharmaceutical investment, right? The line goes, in terms of strengthening and lengthening patents goes up this way, and then investment in research and development goes directly downwards. Like it's an inverse, weirdly inverse relation there. So the strategy isn't working, right? Whatever their intentions, it's simply not working to attract in that sector in pharmaceuticals. I can't speak to the numbers with respect to the life sciences, you know, GMOs, those kinds of enhancing digital agriculture. Some of this, I can't speak if it's working in those areas, but there is this desire to have the strongest top level protections of any country, or at least on par with Europe and the United States. And through that, it's a kind of industrial strategy in that you'll get the patented stuff, and you'll lose the ability to compete on, say, the generics or the lower cost stuff, but you'll be getting the good stuff. You know, whether it works or not, it certainly doesn't work in pharmaceuticals as far as the numbers go, but I don't know about, I can't speak to the other sectors.
Thanks, Stuart. Richard?
My question is, I'm wondering about the growing talk about friendshoring and friendly trade and investment alliances. And that's perhaps more recent. I know, having edited the previous volume, the chapters get written a lot in advance, but this growing talk about friendshoring and how it might change your analysis or how you see things.
Who would like to take that? Or do you want to direct it to someone, Richard?
Well, I could send it to Stuart because I told him I'd ask him a tough question.
Okay.
I'd be interested, Laura and Elizabeth.
But it could go to anyone.
Well. I question this. I mean, the friendshoring sounds great. It sounds new, but I also question how new it is. I mean, I thought, you know, if you look at the Harper government's trade policy and this kind of, I forget the term they used, economic something. Anyway, it was this idea that, yeah, it was economic diplomacy. That was it, right? Like, you know, I thought free trade agreements were friendshoring. I thought that's what the idea was. You pick a country where you want to do more good stuff, good trade, good business, and you favor their imports and investment. But this is something different, I suppose, and very much, you know, not polarizing, but very much exclusive, right? I mean, friendshoring seems to be entirely tied to not China. You know what I mean? Like, these are our friends around China, and they literally surround China, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, just like the TPP did. Those are the friends. China's not the friend. Anyway, so I am kind of suspicious of using it and getting too close to that term or too close to the Biden agenda for Canada. There's very much the same old, as far as I can see, imperial ambitions in the region. But, you know, what are the alternatives at the moment? And is it possible to do that in ways that will have benefits that are immediate and needed, like rapid decarbonization is one of the questions. You know, do we need Chinese dirt and solar panels to do this? You know, maybe not. But can't lose sight of the fact that it is still an exclusive club. It's not China. It's also not most of Africa for the moment, not most of Latin America for the moment. It's a very Atlanticist looking club that turns me off a little bit.
Maybe I could just follow up. I mean, yes, in terms of trade policy, but I was thinking when you guys were talking about that, about the recent last year's Summit of the Americas, in which as Biden decided not to invite countries like Cuba, but also Venezuela and Nicaragua to the annual meeting after years of Latin American governments fighting to get Cuba into the summit. Now he's like kicked out Cuba and two other governments who's, you know, who are engaging in abhorrent practices, but I'm not sure like kicking them out is a good response to that. And it seems like the kind of old, almost Cold War style liberal imperialist kind of behavior. But I do think that nearshoring is a thing. It's not just ideological. It's it is responding to partly to the new rules of origin in the USMCA or CUSMA, whatever we want to call it. We debated this when we're editing the text because different authors use different terms. But the higher rules of origin are driving nearshoring in the sense of greater location of investment in Mexico, Canada, and US, as opposed to other countries, especially Asia, and the breakdown of supply chains, global supply chains, that's led to firms trying to locate investment closer to home where it's a bit more predictable and controllable to a certain extent. So, you know, if we shift the term to nearshoring, I think there's something less ideological and more another aspect of the contemporary global economy where we're seeing more return to regional economic blocks as opposed to dreams of globalization. Anyone else want to come in on that question? Noah, did you have any comments? Sorry, I feel like I'm teaching a class here. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
I'll just make one quick
Okay,
comment.
go ahead, Liz.
Related to investment, and that is that you see in US policy kind of a link between getting rid of ISDS and nearshoring. And in fact, the rationale from Lighthizer point of view was that strong investor protection is just encouraging offshoring, and it's encouraging corporations to invest outside the US because then it's like they're covered, and that was his primary reason for wanting to get rid of it. And so it does kind of fit with that nearshoring, and also making the case that among our friends, and this is the Atlanticist side, we don't need it. So we don't need it with Canada, we don't need it with the UK. And so there's a bit of a pattern there on the investment side as well.
Great, yeah. And there's a fabulous publication from CCPA by Hadrian Mertens Kirkwood that looks at how we keep ISDS in our trade agreements with smaller countries, smaller, weaker countries, while we're forced to take it out of the USMCA. Any other comments? Noah, did you want to respond?
Sure. I think with respect to rules of origin and CUSMA, it appears that perhaps nearshoring may be an outcome of the agreement, though it doesn't necessarily seem in the negotiations that was a primary concern, at least under the Trump administration. Perhaps that is a point of departure, getting back to the earlier conversation between Biden and Trump. But I think there's limited evidence under the Biden administration that has been a main feature until recently. It could be, as Laura has recognized, a reaction to a shifting global environment under the stress of inflation and global supply chains breakdowns.
Great. Actually, that was the question I wanted to raise for our authors, if they maybe we could conclude with this since we were aiming at an hour. Could you guys respond to what's changed since the chapters came out? We were actually, you know, as Richard knows, we may have got you guys to write these chapters quite a while ago, but it's pretty rapid, just-in-time production as academic publishing goes. But things have changed since the chapters were written. And one thing in particular is what Noah has mentioned, which is inflation and the rise in the cost of living, the energy crisis, the war in Ukraine, none of which we really were able to deal with in this book. Do any of you have any thoughts about how that might change the game in terms of the global economic environment and or Canadian responses to that environment?
I could start, Laura, if that's okay.
Sure, please.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that's changed is we have the results of the Biden Build Back Better campaign, right? The presidential campaign. Probably all he's going to get, I'm not sure, in terms of the CHIPS Act, you know, several tens of billions of dollars or $100 billion towards trying to revive a homegrown silicon chip industry. Inflation Reduction Act, which of course is much smaller than what Biden and Harris had originally proposed, and ditched a lot of the really positive care economy components as well, which I think is important, right? So that the industrial strategy we're getting is a very, it's gender biased in some ways, right? If you look at sectors that are going to be benefiting from that. Nonetheless, it's a lot of money. It is a much bigger role for the state than we had envisioned or we could have predicted, I think, at the time of writing the chapter. It's really getting down there, full transparency of supply chains. They want to be able to act in ways, right? They want to be the buyer of last resort, for example, which gets to somewhat to the point Noah was making, going to the point of guaranteeing that the state will buy all these heat pumps, right? If the people don't buy them with these tax credits, the state is there. They've invoked the Defense Production Act to give, confidence to companies to come and invest. And I think we've seen a lot of investment jumping in with respect to battery plants, electric vehicles, and I haven't seen much more with respect to solar. But anyway, so things are happening. Things seem to be working as planned. With respect to the war, I guess we couldn't have predicted the boon to the Canadian economy that this war would be in terms of resource exports, fertilizer, crude metals. Deficits are shrinking. The Canadian economy's not going to be in any rush to transform from this kind of high intensity, high carbon model we have, because for the moment we're stand to benefit, and we stand, at least on politically, we stand to be benefiting our friends and allies in Europe, right, with respect to their energy crises. Even if, physically that would be very hard to do, right, to build out that infrastructure to get the energy over there. But anyway, so it frustrates or could delay further the transition that we need, and we talked about in the chapter, but I don't think it makes it any more or less feasible or desirable that we move more in that direction in concert, I think, with Mexicans and Biden.
Not that the Mexicans are charging that direction too quickly under the current government of López Obrador. Any other comments from our panelists or anyone else?
I just echo what Stuart said, and that is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been a windfall, and certainly here in Alberta, it's just taken a government from a huge deficit to a huge surplus, and again, reinforcing policies that were hostile to dealing with climate change, certainly at the Alberta level, but also I would argue the federal government has been already, I think, slow in meeting its climate goals in terms of CO2 reduction, and this is not going to advance that. In terms of investment, it hasn't really been, I think, as significant. COVID and the push from the US in relation to China has led Canada to more broadly interpret security in terms of the Investment Canada Act, and that's not likely to change. Russia is not a significant investor, but a number of Canadian corporations, of course, had investments in Russia. And for other prudential reasons, I think those investments are being sold or retrenched. But overall, I think the big impact has been in terms of reinforcing the carbon-based economy, at least certainly here in the West.
Great, thanks, Liz. Noah?
I mean, one of the thoughts emerging from our chapter is that as these crises continue to proliferate, we thought that there'd be greater opportunities to reconsider alternatives to the current rules-based international order. And it seems that the increase in crises, in particular the war in Ukraine, has done the opposite effect. It has kind of lulled Canada even further, to the point the political economic explanations advanced by Stuart and Elizabeth are one factor of it. It doesn't seem that the defensive consensus that has emerged from NATO and Western countries has necessarily spilled over into a more collaborative relationship between Canada and the United States or some of its allies on trade issues. It seems that we're still par for the course from where we were 1 year ago. We didn't anticipate so much the shift in EV credits, though I'm not sure how optimistic I am about what that reflects about Canada and the United States, more so the challenges that it says about battery building capacity in the United States and their reliance on Canada to produce EV vehicles.
Great. Well, thanks to everybody. I think I'll close the session now as originally anticipated after about an hour. And I'd really like to thank all our participants for their fabulous contributions. I'd like to encourage everybody to go out and get that book or ask your institutions to do so. It's already in the Carleton Library. And I would encourage everybody to look at the rest of the book because we're going to have a couple of other book launches. So stay tuned about that for the rest of the book. There's other fabulous chapters, including by Rosalind Warner, who's here on this disaster risk governance, a timely issue at the moment, and by Carlo Dade, who's also here on the Canada-US-China triangle and the whole section on Canada, US, China trade wars, etc. All like fascinating, compelling stuff. So I hope you can go out and check out the rest of the book. So thanks to everybody for joining us. Greetings from Manchester. And
thank you, Laura, and thank everybody for coming.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks very much, Laura.
And
thanks,
thanks for
Elizabeth,
Stu and CCPA for doing the technical crazy side that scares me. Okay, take care. Bye, everybody.